If you're a software engineer, you've been there. You're finally relaxing after a long day and you get paged. Something's broken. Are the servers down? Is the database slow? Is there a bug in the latest deployment? Now the whole team is panicked, going from tool to tool and person to person to troubleshoot the problem. That won't happen if you get New Relic. New Relic brings together 16 monitoring tools so teams can see across the entire stack from one place. More importantly, with New Relic, you can pinpoint problems down to the line of code to fix problems more quickly. That's why more than 14,000 companies, including DoorDash, GitHub, and Epic Games, use New Relic to debug and improve their software. The next late night call is just waiting to happen. Get New Relic before it does. You can get the whole New Relic platform and 100 gigs of data free forever. No credit card required. Just visit newrelic.com/cloudcast. That's newrelic.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Back for another Sunday Perspective show here in early May 2022. It's good to be back. As Aaron and I talked about the last few weeks, we're going to take a break from doing Sunday Perspectives every week. We're going to try and do them every other week, partially, do some travel coming up, but also because we have a whole bunch of really good shows that have been queued up and we had a chance to record a little earlier. And I think, just based on some of the feedback we've seen on the last few weeks' shows, I think the perspective is that they're pretty good topics. So, but excited to dig into today's Sunday Perspective show. I'm going to try and do something a little bit different. I'm going to try, on Sunday Perspective show, we've covered a lot of different things. We've done a lot of different formats, but one of the formats that we've done has been, sort of like look back and look at certain technologies and how they evolved. And so we had looked at Docker and Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes and some other stuff. And so one of the things I thought we would try and do today is start a new sort of format. We'll see how this comes across. But we're going to take a topic that sometimes is perceived to be, complicated or, sort of a deep technical topic, and try and use some analogies and look at a way to explain it such that, people that might have to, start digging into this now, this is new to them, maybe gives them a starting point. And I thought what I would do is use Service Mesh as sort of the first one, partially because it's something that I have to do in my day job. I try not to mix up too much between the day job and the podcast. But the second reason I picked Service Mesh was a couple of things. One, KubeCon's coming up. KubeCon EU is coming up here in a couple of weeks, and Service Mesh will obviously be a big topic there. Istio just recently got donated, or will be donated formally to the CNCF, and so that'll bring a couple of different service meshes into the CNCF. So I think there'll be a lot of discussion between Linkerd and Istio and maybe some others that are out there. But also, looking at some of the numbers that have come out of the CNCF recently, Kubernetes is, continuing to see a lot of uptake. And I think what we tend to see in the service mesh world is, once companies start using Kubernetes, once they start spinning up more microservices, start having multiple clusters, which is maybe a couple of years into their usually into their journey, they start looking at, how do I secure those microservices? How do I secure the communication? How do I better manage the microservice to microservice communication? How do I manage cluster to cluster communication? And that's really where Service Mesh comes into play. So what I'm going to try and do is try and explain Service Mesh, do it in a little bit different way than you probably heard before. Try and use an analogy that I think a lot of us can relate to, and try and bring it back to, how does Service Mesh sort of fit into an evolving sort of monolith to microservices type of architecture and set of applications. And we'll do that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Ravello. Having a hard time hiring engineers? Ravello lets you sidestep the competitive U.S. talent market by helping you hire skilled remote engineers in Latin America. They provide full-time senior engineers with 5+ years of experience who are embedded in your team like a normal hire. Ravello is an end-to-end solution that handles sourcing, vetting, hiring, payroll, and compliance. They also don't force you to pay for things you don't want, like a project manager. You can interview any engineer before deciding. All engineers are proficient in English, and have high time zone alignment with US-based teams. You don't have that painful 24-hour turnaround where you have a question for an engineer who is on the other side of the world. Check out Revelo today. Go to revelo.com/cloudcast. Check it out. That's revelo.com/cloudcast.
Still using SSH keys, RDP logins, and database credentials? It's time to access your infrastructure like it's no longer 1999. StrongDM is the only modern infrastructure access platform. It creates a seamless, secure, and observable air gap between your staff and the critical infrastructure that powers your company. Instantly revoke access to every database, Kubernetes cluster, or server with a click. Automatically log every query, SSH, and kube control command to know who did what, when, and where across your stack. Eliminate credentials from end-user workflows to deploy access that's zero trust and least privilege by default. Trusted by your peers at Peloton, SoFi, Yext, and Chime, StrongDM is the only way to deploy secure access controls in a way folks love to use. But who believes an ad? Check it out for yourself with a no BS demo. Sign up at www.strongdm.com/get-a-demo.
And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to try this approach to sort of, looking at how to explain a technical topic in a way that's not really complicated. Obviously, a podcast is an audio medium. It's not a visual medium. We will try and include some pictures that I've drawn up. If I can embed them into the podcast, I will. If not, we'll put them out on Twitter and maybe put a link to them in the show notes as well. But here's the way I want to try and explain this. I'm going to use an analogy, and hopefully, the analogy makes sense to folks, because I think in most cases, I don't want to assume for everybody, but in most cases, people grew up in a family, and at least there was probably at least one of you. In many cases, you probably had siblings as well. So I'm going to kind of explain service mesh in the context of a family, not only a family that grows from two parents, but to a family that starts having multiple children. And, the children are going to be a couple of years apart, right? So let me kind of walk through this analogy. So let's start with, imagine if we were drawing a picture, you're going to draw yourself a box. And within that box, you're going to have two squares. One's going to be labeled D or F for dad or father, and M for mother. Again, those are just placeholders for parent. And what we're going to do is we're going to sort of, those two things are living within this one home, within one thing. And the beginning of this analogy is think of this as this is, a monolithic application that really just has two parts to it, two important parts. Doesn't matter what they are, front end and back end, whatever. And everything they do, all their communication is done directly within this one contained unit, being the house. Okay. So you can think of that as a monolithic application that runs on one server or, one environment. Now, quickly, the family dynamics change. And over the next couple of years, 3 children are born. Okay. And those 3 children, 1, 2, and 3, we're going to say they're a couple of years apart just because that'll play into the analogy as we work along. We're going to call those 1, 2, and 3. And at the beginning, not a whole lot has changed. They've been added to the nucleus of this family. They've been added to the nucleus of this monolithic application. They've added some new capabilities and functionalities, but they're all basically, residing as one monolith. All of the communication is still done directly. It's still done only within this one unit, this one house. And they basically, everything is sort of dictated by the two big parts of the application, the parents, and the children, or the kind of smaller elements really only do a couple of things. They eat, they poop, they sleep, they cry, and they play. Right. And this goes on for a number of years, and it's all fine. Everything's pretty easy to manage. The two sort of parent, controls of this monolithic application can take care of everything. Everything's okay. Now, as the children, as 1, 2, and 3 start to get older, we start to introduce some aspects that change the nature of the application, and the nature of the interaction between sort of the two parent aspects of the application or the household and the 3 kids. And a couple of those things include things like, maybe it's having to provide a level of protection in the house, right? So as you think about it as children move from, sort of having to be held all the time or only being able to crawl to they start to be able to, kind of pick themselves up and hold themselves up like on a table or a couch, and they start to walk around. And so you have to start protecting the environment, right? You have to start putting some protections in place because those 1, 2, and 3 aspects of the application aren't behaving exactly the way they did before. And we want to put some controls in place so that they don't hurt themselves, basically, right? And we're still doing this within the the concept of a monolithic application. A couple other things we may need to do. We may need to introduce some rate limiting, such that, if one of the children is crying all the time, we have a mechanism to shut down that crying, whether it's with a pacifier or a bottle or some way to put them to sleep. We want to do some rate limiting such that, they behave accordingly. They don't take up all the resources. And then we may need to do some things in which we have to build in some sort of back off algorithms or retry algorithms. So think of this as, hey, I told you to put your toys away. You didn't listen. Hey, I told you to put your toys away. You didn't listen. Hey, I told you to put your toys away. So sometimes we have to build in some things into the communication paths between these elements in which we have to repeat things several times in order to make sure that the actual task gets done and that it's acknowledged and it gets done. And so as you see, what happens over time with these, sort of these parental elements of an application of a monolith and the smaller elements that have been added to augment the whole thing, they still act as one. All their communication is still very much sort of direct. They know everything about each other. They know where they are. They know where everybody's schedule is. But we begin to have to start to introduce these things because the behaviors of some of the aspects of the application are changing, and they need to be controlled. They need to have back off and timeouts and retries and things like that. And then we may get into a situation where, let's suppose those children applications have grown older. Maybe they're 6, 4, and 2. And you start realizing, well, I can't say the exact same thing to the 4-year-old as I can say to the 6-year-old. Maybe it's something like, hey, if you eat all your food, if you eat all your vegetables, you'll get ice cream as a dessert, as a reward. But I can't necessarily say that to the 4-year-old because I know the 4-year-old only loves ice cream and, they won't eat their vegetables. And so maybe we need to set up some secure communication such that what you say between the parents and the 6-year-old is not seen or snooped on by the 4-year-old. So we set up some security between these things, right? So again, we're evolving the application. The things have changed within the construct of how they communicate, but we're still fundamentally sort of looking at this as a as a big, sort of one unit. Everything's kind of coordinated together. Now, as things again begin to age, right? So maybe kids become 8 and 10 or 10 and 12. And again, the age doesn't matter, but we're just getting into a stage in which they're beginning to do some things in which they're, starting to push the boundaries of that parental space of the home, right? Of the monolith. And maybe we're starting to get into situations in which, the way we schedule these different 1, 2, and 3s is going to be different. Right? Maybe the 12-year-old has sports and the 8-year-old has, practice at school for music, or the 10-year-old wants to go play with their friends. Well, now we're getting into situations in which they're not all doing the same thing. We have to be able to be aware of how many resources they use. And we also need to be able to sort of schedule them and coordinate them between, all these things. And this is sort of the natural way that monolithic applications kind of evolve. They evolve with the business, or in this case, they evolve with the family analogy. And you have to start thinking about, can we continue to manage all the functionality that this thing does in the same way, right? Does it make sense to manage everything the same way? Do we want to manage the 6-year-old the same way we manage the 12-year-old? Do we want to still have the same type of communication between all of them? Right? What happens as those things start to change, right? And again, the analogy here is, your business is going to start to do some things differently. Maybe you're going to interact with your customers through mobile, or you're going to create a different way to work with your partners, right? You're going to set up some digital way to interact with your partners, or you're going to have, a new set of services that are going to be available, right? And the analogy to this is, we start getting into situations in which maybe the kids are starting to interact with things outside the house. Maybe they're going to interact with friends. Maybe you're starting to get in situations in which, the older kids are always with their friends, in which case you can't just directly interact with them. You have to think about both of them as, something new. And then maybe you start getting into situations in which, let's say, for example, around the house, you always played one set of music. Maybe it was country music, or maybe it was classic music, whatever it was. Well, now you start getting into situations in which, the different age kids want to listen to different music, right? The analogy being like, you may have groups within your organization who say, hey, I have to build parts of those applications, but I want to write them in Java. I want to write them in Go. I want to write them in Python. I want to write them in Node, right? And these are the things that we start to get into. And so this is typically where you start seeing businesses and application teams say, hey, we can't keep managing the monolith the same way. We're going to have to start breaking it up. We're going to have to start breaking it up in ways that allow those things that these different groups, the kids in this analogy, want, in a way that they can still come back into the fold. They can still be part of the bigger way that the parental system, the family unit, if you will, works, but they have to have some flexibility. And we can't necessarily use the same rules that we apply to a 15 or 16-year-old that we do to an 8-year-old, right? So we start getting into situations in which you go, okay, how do I do that? How do I break this thing apart, right? And then how do we reapply, if you will, the things, those core constructs of how do they communicate with each other? How do they find each other? How do they know what's going on between each other? How do we secure the communication so that, again, given the different things that are going on between the different elements, how do we do rate limiting? How do we do those back off and retry logic? Where do we put that? And all those elements are really sort of what make up a service mesh, right? So as we start to break up the monolith and we take all those aspects of how that big unit communicated back when everything was sort of, I know where everybody is, I sort of know exactly how everybody works, I can generally, keep them aligned and coordinated. I can find where they are, I can communicate to them directly where I need to without other things happening. And I know what the response time is going to be, right? Like when I tell the kids, go upstairs, take your clothes off, get into bed, I know it's going to take a certain amount of time. Well, when they become teenagers, you don't know how long that's going to take. Well, the analogy to that is that's the equivalent of, well, we used to communicate with each other over the backplane of one server, and now we communicate over a network which could have, variable response times, and it could have failures and other things that you can't necessarily anticipate, but you've got to be able to work around. So we start getting into the situation of, well, that's when you start to look at, does a service mesh start to add some value here? And this is really where it sort of comes into play. So let me start to expand this analogy a little bit. So imagine you now have, a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 16-year-old in the house. Well, if it's like a lot of families, everybody in the family went from they did whatever they did within the house to everybody's got a device. Everybody's got some sort of mobile device. And maybe a 10-year-old's too young, but whatever. And so now the way that you're going to communicate, and, parents, you're going to be nodding your head with this, a lot of times the way you're going to communicate with your kid, even if they're upstairs or out in the backyard or whatever, is instead of just yelling at them or walking over to them, you might send them a text message. You might call them. You might FaceTime them. You might snap them. And so what you've done is you've replaced the sort of direct communication. Now what you've done is you've moved that communication, that way of finding where the kid is, right? Discovery of where that person is, that application is, the way of communicating with them, the way of verifying how you're going to communicate with them. You've moved that to a sort of a proxy device or a third-party device or a control point device. And in most of the service mesh architectures, they introduce sort of a proxy to go along with every aspect, every microservice. And the different service meshes do it slightly differently. But what they do is, in essence, they put a control point with the application. And that control point, does a number of smart things. It knows about the microservice. It's able to go out and discover other microservices. It's able to secure communication between any microservices. It's able to be the place where you implement logic that says, hey, if I need to rate limit between A and B, that's how I would do it. if I need to build some retry logic or failover logic, that's where I would do it. Because again, you never know at any given point what new applications are going to come into play. And so what you do is you build in that logic into the mesh so that you don't have to constantly be doing it for every application. You don't have to think about, is this kid into goth? Is this kid into heavy metal? Is this kid into, country music? Is this kid into just banging a tambourine? You build all that sort of logic into the service mesh, and then you can allow the freedom of what each one of those kids or those microservices of this analogy to be able to go do on their own, right? They have some freedom and flexibility. And so, this is where, you start to see the things that happen within service mesh with that sort of proxied control point. And, in the analogy we use, the cell phone or the iPad or something, the way that you communicate with the child, but you're doing it sort of through a third party, a secondary, tertiary type of device or control point that, again, helps in figuring out where they are, in having secure communication, in being able to, coordinate how you do things. And then the last piece of this that really comes into play is you start thinking about scenarios in which, as the kids get older, maybe you're communicating with them. Maybe you're communicating with their friend who is sort of an intermediary for them. They're part of a, kind of a little group of them. Maybe you have to coordinate all of them now. Who's coming over for dinner? Who's sleeping over? All right, I can't just coordinate with one microservice. I got to now coordinate with 3 or 4 of them, but I have to think about them as a little group. But what they do is all this one sort of service. And so another thing that service mesh begin to do nowadays, especially in a lot of the architectures, is they will begin to embed sort of an external routing mechanism or an API gateway, if you will, for getting to external services. Because maybe what you're doing is you're communicating with other parents, with their friends, with a school, with a team, a coach, a club, their job, right? Any of those sort of things. But those are external to your household, but they're part of making the overall set of capabilities sort of work together. And so, if we think about kind of the path that we went down with this analogy, the family started, they're in one house, it's just the parents, all the communication is done face-to-face. We start to add some kids, all the communication is still done face-to-face. We basically know exactly how the kids operate. They basically all operate the same. As the kids start to evolve, just like as aspects of applications evolve, we have to start building some things in to deal with their different ways of coordinating, of how they act, how we handle their behavior, their good behavior and their bad behavior. We have to make sure we can handle things like security and noisy neighbors and rate limiting when they get too loud, or we have to, break up fights between them, if you will. We have to start coordinating schedules, who's going to use resources. And then as we start to think about microservices, right, because things got out of control, we just can't keep managing those kids the same way that we did when they were 2 and 4 and 3. They're now teenagers. We're going to start to give them a certain amount of autonomy, and we're going to still, build into the system, into the service mesh, if you will, that same logic that we used to have when everything was just face-to-face, you directly talking to the kids, you controlling their music, you yelling at them, whatever it would had to be. And you're putting some mechanisms in place such that they're going to have a certain amount of freedom to do what they want. They can start to work on their own schedule, but the way that they're still going to interact with the broader family, with their friends, with their communities, all those things, have these control points. And again, we use the cell phone proxy as the sort of the analogy within that. So hopefully this was sort of a, useful way for you to think about, how a monolith sort of becomes a set of microservices, and where service mesh really starts to come into play, taking those things that you used to do as a monolith, all as sort of inter-process communication, start to extend those as services that are available on the network that are taken care of by the service mesh. They manage policies, they manage communication, they manage observability, and how, you can draw a sort of analogy to, how a family evolves from early age to older age, and the kids start to do things that they want to do, and the parents are still trying to provide a little bit of control and sanity. So hopefully that was interesting to you. We'll try and do this more often if we can find some interesting topics. I'll include some of my pictures. I'll find a way to get those out on the network or in Twitter or somewhere else. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. Sorry. But anyways, thank everybody for listening. Thanks everybody for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. And it's good to be back for Sunday Perspective Show. And I'll be back for another one in a couple of weeks, and we'll be back to talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.